Okay, welcome to everyone who will be listening to this webinar. Today, we are joined by Kate Raworth and Andrew Fanning, whom we thank very much for their collaboration. Although many of you already know them for sure, I would like to recall just a few facts about Kate Raworth and about Andrew Fanning. Kate Raworth is an economist who has been working in Oxfam for many years. And since then, she has become world famous for her book, Doughnut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist. And since she published the book, she created also the Doughnut Economics Action Lab to turn it into practice. Andrew Fanning is currently data and analysis lead at Doughnut Economics Action Lab and a visiting research fellow in the Sustainability Research Institute. His research in the field of ecological economics focuses mainly on understanding what changes are needed to maintain or to improve human well-being, while at the same time ensuring that the environmental pressures of economic activity are kept within local and planetary boundaries. I am Luca Sardo, and I study economics at the University of Turin, together with Giulio De Candia, who is here with us today. And I have also been part of the Fridays for Future movement for over 2 years now. In recent months, we have interviewed many scientists and economists. I don't know if economists want to be called scientists as well, who are putting forward proposals on how to solve the main challenges of our century, among which certainly the one we feel most urgent and most terrifying as well is climate change. I now leave the word to Giulio, who will present the main features of the book Doughnut Economy, which we will discuss after.
Thank you, Luca. So the book Doughnut Economy is a perfect guide to tackling this problem, because I found that it finally puts the long-term objectives we want to achieve back at the center of economic analysis. Often, even when we were studying at university, it seems to us that the objectives were taken for granted. We must continue to increase our country's output, and that we simply discuss possible strategies for doing so, without asking ourselves who and why had chosen that objective. Doughnut Economics, on the other hand, redesigns our economy by first establishing what is the social foundation, so education, food, health, gender equality, and what is the ecological ceiling that we must not cross: climate change, loss of biodiversity, air pollution. The first question I would like to ask you starts from this. One of the things that struck me is that after the publication of the book, you created a real action lab with which to move from words to actions. This is a very good approach from the point of view of climate activists, because unfortunately we are running out of time. Our carbon budget is running out faster and faster, and we need to start acting. So I wanted to ask you, how is the Doughnut Economics Action Lab working, and what results have you achieved?
That's a great question, Giulio. Thank you. And thanks for this lovely opportunity for us both to talk with you. I'm sorry we can't be talking in Italian. Andrew and I will have to brush up on our language skills and come back next time in Italian. So I wrote Doughnut Economics, the book, as an act of advocacy. I'm an advocate, right? I spent 11 years working at Oxfam. And when I first drew the donut diagram, we published it at Oxfam, and it had more traction with people, more interest than I ever imagined. It's like, wow, pictures are powerful. And then I realized the most effective thing I could do was to leave my job at Oxfam and write this book, because pictures are powerful, but also ideas are very, very powerful in the way they shape everything that we believe we should do. They shape our vision, and I wanted to be part of rewriting economics. So I wrote the book. It came out in 2017, and I have to say, Italy was the first country to publish a translation. So Italy is the first country that I visited. I have the book here somewhere, actually. Where is it? Oh, I can't see it right now. What I love about the Italian edition of the book is that it's called the ciambella, right? Because the ciambella is a cake, and it's also the thing that saves us from drowning. So it's perfect. It makes complete sense. So the book came out in 2017. I spent 2 years going around giving talks about this book. Oh, you could do this, you could do that. Imagine if we lived in this economy, imagine. And after the talks I was giving, people would come up to me and say, I'm a teacher. I'm actually already teaching this in my classroom because I believe the 15-year-old students who I teach deserve to know this. Or I'm a town councillor and I'm bringing this into our meetings. Or I run a startup business and I want to design my business around this. Or I'm a community activist and I want to do this. So it became really clear to me that it was not enough to stand on a stage and say, imagine if we did this, imagine, like, there are people doing this. So that was what motivated me, that the next piece of advocacy is not a book, it's action. And so let's create an organization. And I never wanted to make a big institute, it's too heavy. But when the idea of an action lab came around, that I thought that's exciting because one, action is in the name. So we really know what we're doing. And two, it's a lab, it's an experiment. We are learning, we are trying with other people. So together with the co-founder, Carlota Sand, who's Spanish, she and I founded Doughnut Economics Action Lab. And so delighted to have Andrew and other team members join us. We're a very small team, we're just 7 people. And our aim is to stay small because we know there are change makers everywhere, in Fridays for Future, in transition towns, working on well-being, working inside government, working in the streets. We know there's change makers everywhere. So we are creating ideas and tools that people can pick up and use, and they'll adapt them and bring them back even better. So that's the purpose of the Action Lab. And like Fridays for Future, we believe that if there's one thing that this decade is about, it's action. And it's not happening on anything like the scale that's required. I'll say 2 more things because you've asked such a key question. We have really clear principles of how we work. And 2 of them are, 1, go where the energy is. So we have never once knocked on anybody's door, asked them or begged them or requested them to talk about the donut or use the donut, because we don't need to. There are change makers everywhere who say, I am already ready to do this. In fact, I'm already doing it. So we work with those people. And the second principle is we work with peer-to-peer inspiration. So just as the whole Fridays for Future movement sprung up around seeing one young person protesting in the street, and she inspired another and another and another, and suddenly millions of students are inspired by each other. So we believe that a city mayor inspires a city mayor, and a business leader inspires a business leader, and a community activist. So in our work, we focus on peer-to-peer inspiration, and we celebrate the work of the pioneers, and we hold them up, and we know that they are the most appealing reason why somebody else might get involved, and that's what's happening.
Thank you very much. So the next question, as I mentioned in the introduction, the latest UNFCCC report warns of the danger of exceeding the Paris targets because the national governments are not acting as they should to reduce their emissions. I note that there is a very wide gap between what international organizations are proposing. For example, UN Secretary Gutierrez seems to have clearly understood the urgency of changing our economic model to deal with the environmental emergencies we face, and what national governments are doing. It seems to me that the same gap exists between local and national governments, because local authorities are trying with difficulty to rethink our cities from a different perspective. Have you noticed this gap? And if so, what do you think it is due to?
Andrew, go for it.
I'll jump in there, and thanks. I can echo Kate's comments. It's wonderful to see you all, and I do need to practice my Italian, so thank you for having this in English. It's really great. I'll throw in some ideas, and if Kate wants to jump in, when it comes to how the targets to actually achieve the transformation and reductions in emissions and just staying within planetary boundaries that is needed. I think that you're right, that at the city level, we're seeing a lot of momentum. it would be wonderful if at the national level, we were still seeing the same type of powerful momentum and energy around how can we actually reduce emissions. It would have been even better if all of this occurred, of course, 30 years ago, right? Or when the UNFCCC was founded in 1992, climate change was recognized as a clear risk to human civilization, and the nations of the world came together probably before, I mean, I had just been born and possibly before either of you had been born, in terms of the nations of the world saying, yes, climate change, let's act. And now we are, of course, where we are today, and the nations are not acting at the scale that's needed. So globally, it would be great. Hasn't happened. Nationally, as you just said, we need 50% reductions. We're at 1% according to the UN. Hasn't happened. It would be wonderful. So where the energy is that we see, so as Kate just mentioned, we're going where the energy is. We're seeing it at the city level of people both within cities as well as out on the streets, pushing for the change and identifying what can be done in their particular context. But of course, how do you recognize that the city operates within a nation, which operates within the globe, and how do we align the, you know, the targets so that it actually gets achieved? One of the ways that we're working on doing it, as Kate said, is essentially through peer-to-peer inspiration. So if we're working with cities right now, of course, if we start working with national governments, then hopefully a minister can inspire a minister, for example, and we can start building change that way, recognizing that, of course, other groups and other organizations are also part of this ecosystem working towards change together. So I'll leave it there. It was kind of, yeah, those are some thoughts that came off the top of my head.
And I'll just pick up on that last point that Andrew made, because it was the one thing I wanted to say, which is we realize that going where the energy is not enough. I mean, if everybody just went where the energy is, we would never get there. So we recognize that there are many, many different actors in this ecosystem of campaigners and change makers on climate change and transformation. And different groups play different roles. So when I'm at work at Deal, our principle is we go where the energy is. We work with the ones who are ready. We highlight them. We showcase the positive, and that's inspiring. At the weekend, I go on Fridays for Future marches with my daughter. She's a really, she's got a beautiful sign, Stop Climate Change, that she made when she was about 6. She's now 12. I also go on Extinction Rebellion and I block bridges, and I'm part of that. So, and each of us chooses which role suits me, which role suits my personality. Do I want to be shouting in the street? Do I want to be quietly working inside government? Do I want to be setting up the new? We can do all of them, but we need all of them. So you need the people who are protesting and bringing down the old and exposing corruption and shaming governments that don't act. And you need the people who are celebrating the ones who do act and bring forward the new. And that's why Friday Future is so important and so valuable. The moral integrity and the responsibility that the young generation can hold. My generation, I'm 50 years old. So my generation and the policymakers who are the same age as me, who got the same education as me, who have the same mindset that I inherited, your generation can hold us to account in the way that no other people can. And it's incredibly important. It's our responsibility, not yours, but you make that responsibility stronger.
Okay, thank you very much. And yes, this is also part of the following question that I wanted to ask, and it fits perfectly with what you said, because next year, actually in September, October, many of the Italian city councils, local authorities, will be re-elected. So there will be elections in Rome, in Milan, in Naples, in Turin. And of course, we have, like Fridays for Future, a group in every city, and we will be pushing for creating an environmentally friendly agenda in every city. And so our question is, how do you think that it's possible to implement the Doughnut Economics book and framework at the city level? I saw that you worked with Amsterdam, with Brussels, and what are, like, in your opinion, the most important things that a city council can do, and that, of course, we can like push them to do?
Oh, that's a great question. Can I share a slide quickly?
Yes, of course, of course. Do I need
Okay,
to give you some permission, or is there?
Yeah, let me
Yes, it's
just hang
possible.
on. Lovely. I just have a slide I just happen to have ready in case. Oh, you'll
Okay.
need to enable me to share my screen.
Yes. How do I do it?
So if you click on share screen, then you can let multiple participants share.
Try now.
There we go. Thank you. Okay, so look, I happen to have here a slide that asks this very question. Yeah, so let's imagine we're in Milan, okay? Just and anybody watching this, you can think of any city that you are in, whether it's an Italian city or somewhere else. So this is the question here that we invite every ambitious city to ask itself. We think this is the 21st century question for cities. So how can Milan become a home to thriving people in a thriving place while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? Now, that's a big question. So we break it down into 4 components, okay? So let's start where we would generally start. What would it mean for the people of Milan to thrive? So what is the good life in Milan? And only the people of the city can answer this question, right? What is a good life? What would it mean for us all to have our essential needs met? Depending on who is in the city, the full diversity of people, their values, their culture, their history, that is for the people of the city to decide. Then there's the question of what would it mean for Milan to thrive within its natural habitat? I mean, where on the surface of this living planet is the city of Milan situated? And what is nature's genius in this place? Nature has learned how to thrive on the Italian landscape, in that temperature, in that latitude, with that kind of rain, with that kind of climate. So the wildland next door, the wildland of Italy, sequesters carbon dioxide. It stores groundwater after a storm. It houses biodiversity, birds and species. It builds soil. It cools the air. It cleanses the air. What if the city of Milan began to aim to be as generous as the wildland next door, and actually to cool the air on a very hot summer's day, to clean the air, to house biodiversity, to house insects and animals that create pollinator corridors through the city, to store groundwater when it rains instead of having flash floods in the street? So these 2 local lenses, we call them the local aspiration of a city, thriving people in a thriving place. And this is what cities actually often focus on. But every city, and especially those like yours and ours, are cities in the global north, are high income cities that have a very big impact because they're embedded in social and ecological systems worldwide. So we also have to ask, what would it mean for Milan to respect the health of the whole planet? So think of all the products that are imported every day into the city, the food, the clothing, the electronics goods, the consumer products, the construction materials. They're coming from all over the world. And they have an ecological footprint in terms of carbon dioxide emissions, in terms of material use, water, fertilizer. So they have a footprint on the planet. And Milan, like all high income cities, I can tell you, is living way beyond its share of ecological impact. Huge carbon emissions, we know, but also excessive material use, fertilizer, water going into this, not in the city itself, but all around the world. So the city needs to calm back within its impact on the planet. And that's about a low carbon city, but also a circular city where materials and resources are used again and again. Then think still of those supply chains, the food and the clothing, electronics and the consumer goods. Think of the people involved in those global supply chains. So who picked and packed the food, who stitched and sewed the clothes, who dug and transported the minerals, who assembled our mobile phones? What are the labor rights for people in those supply chains? What are the impact on communities that live, for example, near lithium mines, where all the lithium for electronic batteries are coming from? So these are the local aspirations set in the context of global responsibility. And when we engage with cities, as we are doing increasingly, starting in Amsterdam, but now many more cities are interested, we say, this is the question we invite you to answer for yourselves. What is your ambition in each of these areas? Is your ambition high enough? And how are you doing? And how are you going to track over time how you are doing against this. This is what we call the Doughnut City Portrait. And we think it's a really powerful starting point, not the finishing point, but the starting point for transforming cities. I'm going to share two ideas very quickly with you. Oh, that's what it looks like when it's done in Portland, Philadelphia, and Amsterdam. And I want to get to here. We have inherited economies and cities that are degenerative by design. We're running down the living planet. That's why we know climate change is happening. And we need to create cities that are regenerative by design, where resources are used again and again and again. But we've also inherited cities that are divisive, driving value and opportunity into few hands, and we need to create distributive cities. So I'm going to stop sharing these slides and come back to the conversation. This is the question that we invite all ambitious cities to ask themselves, and we need to move from degenerative to regenerative design, from divisive to distributive design. And now what that looks like in cities, well, that's what I would invite you to put to the city councillors in all the cities. How are you going to make this a regenerative city? How are you going to make this a distributive city so that our city brings us into the donut?
Thank you very much, Kate.
Thank you very much.
This was the answer we were looking for. And
so after reading your book and listening to your interviews, I often wondered, it is enough to abandon one national accounting indicator as GDP to solve all the problems, or do we need a deeper change? If other indicators were used, and there are so many, would we really have solved the problem already?
If we're going to talk indicators, I'm definitely passing that one to Andrew. He's our data and indicator guru.
Oh, thanks.
Great. That's a great question. I mean, of course, the donut, the idea of it is the very beginning, we say that the core purpose for a 21st century economy is to change the purpose of the economy from one of growth into one of balance and of thriving, which is best represented, we believe, or well, we think a very useful way of envisioning that is through the lens of the donut, right? So at the global level, we can say, okay, what are the things that matter? Well, we need to avoid critical human deprivation, and those dimensions of social well-being, of the social foundation, Kate has crowdsourced from the social priorities of the Sustainable Development Goals, of course. So there's food. I need to get myself a lollipop donut as well. So yes, there's food, health, sanitation. You mentioned at the very beginning the various dimensions. So that's powerful, though, that they come from the Sustainable Development Goals, because the world's governments have agreed that those are the priorities for the minimum preconditions for well-being. But so we need to make sure that everybody gets above the social foundation, but as we've said, not overshoot ecological limits. And the boundaries at the global level, of course, are from the planetary boundaries framework, which Earth system scientists argue are the different dimensions, once again, that need to collectively be that we need to stay within in order to keep our Earth system habitable in the state that it's been for the past 12,000 years of the period of the Holocene. So those indicators are, each of them are important. That's what the donut shows. And I believe that that's very, very powerful, because the GDP collapses that information down to a single metric. And we don't believe that that's useful, because each of those different dimensions are needed in order to actually stay within the donut. So to answer the question, I would say there is very much a need to move beyond GDP, and the donut provides a useful frame dashboard for envisioning progress in the 21st century.
And just to illustrate what Andrew was just saying about GDP collapsing the metric, there's the shape of what GDP tells us success looks like. It's just ever rising growth on this single number, the financial value of goods and services sold in an economy in a year. I mean, really, what is being sold? What is being cut down? What is being destroyed? It's missing so much information. And that's why we believe this idea of moving from endless growth to thriving in balance. It's the shape of progress in the 21st century, and we need the new metrics to do that. And actually, one of the reasons, actually the main reason why, when I knew Andrew was available, we said, please come and join us, is because he's done an amazing database for over 150 countries of taking the available data and downscaling them and making national donuts. Shall I show it? Because and Andrew can talk to it, because I think it'd be really nice to share.
Great. So here's the global donut. What we've seen, what it shows, of course, you can see at the very top is the climate change wedge, which Fridays for Future of all organizations and all groups knows we are far beyond. But what the whole picture of the donut shows is, billions of people are still falling short in terms of their social foundation. They don't have, for example, that little wedge for food. It's 11% below the social foundation, which means that 11% of the global population does not have enough to eat. And you can look at that for each of the indicators within the social foundation and see that our current economic system is not meeting the needs of all at current levels, while at the same time, it's of course, collectively, we are overshooting multiple planetary boundaries for climate change, for nitrogen and phosphorus loading, for land conversion, and for critical biodiversity and biodiversity loss. And so, yeah, what this really demonstrates is that we need a new economic system, but we can also bring it down a level, as Kate was saying, and look at the national level. And we did this for 150 countries, but here's a range where you can see 3 countries. We can start with Malawi, where you can see, of course, inside Malawi, it's massively falling short in terms of meeting the social foundation, but the people of Malawi are not overstepping fair shares of planetary boundaries. So they're living well within their shares at an ecological level. When we can look at China, which is simultaneously, like we saw at the global level, it's overshooting various boundaries while at the same time needing to, for the first time, meet the social foundation for its residents. But then, of course, we can look to Norway here with just massive ecological overshoot. There's no way that the level of resource use being consumed in Norway, and by the way, in virtually all high-income nations, could be sustainably extended to all people. So the high social foundation that we see in Norway is coming with just a massive cost in terms of the environment as shown here, but also in terms of the links between the global supply chains within which that consumption in Norway is enabled. So where those burdens take place. So, great. This, you can see, this is 150 countries. And of course, the goal is to be in the donut in the top left-hand corner, where we're meeting the needs of all people without transgressing any boundaries. And what you can see here is that, of course, no country is able to say, I'm there, right? I'm living within a boundary, within the donut. And you can see the countries here, they're spread out. And
I added Italy. There you are, there's Italy.
And we even see Italy here. So you can see that either countries are in the bottom left corner here, where we can think of our low-income nations. What kind of pathway, if we're trying to get into the donut, can countries like Malawi and others, what would that journey towards getting into the donut look like? This wouldn't look like anything that's been done before, because of course, all previous nations have overstepped planetary boundaries while pursuing well-being. We can look to middle income or emerging economies like China. Italy is a little bit strangely placed, just because of, in this case, because I would rank them typically in the high in another situation, but that's where they show up on the chart. But we can think of these nations as well, where it's simultaneously needing to come back within planetary boundaries and meeting all the basic needs of their citizens and residents for the very first time. What would it mean for those nations to go into the donut? So you need new policies, new ideas, new theories, and in order to get there. And of course, thinking of the high-income nations of the world, those countries that like to tell the rest of the world that they are developed. We at Doughnut Economics Action Lab, we don't use the word developed and developing, because we don't believe that there are any nations with respect to the donut that can call themselves that, because these countries as well face an unprecedented transformation, needing to reduce resource use back within planetary boundaries while maintaining the relatively high levels of social well-being, or improving, of course, that are being enjoyed. So this is how we think of progress with respect to the donut. But of course, these bubbles on a chart are not just living single separate realities. What we know is that they're deeply interconnected through history as well as through power, particularly from the global north with respect to the global south. So through histories of colonialism, of military power, of structural adjustment programs in the 1980s and 90s, where low-income and middle-income countries were forced to adopt austerity programs and open up their economies in order to, in exchange for loans for development. But of course, those loans didn't put a lot of investments into education and social services and programs that we know underpin human well-being, and have led to existing stories, of course, of debt and of trade rules, which are systematically in favor of the global north nations. There's current stories of resource extraction and land grabs by multinational corporations, or enabled by foreign direct investment. And of course, the very real story of climate change impacts, which has primarily been caused by nations of the global north, but being felt first and hardest by nations in the global south. So what this picture and what these images show is that there is a profound need for unprecedented transformation, both across countries, but also within them.
And to finish that off, over the 2030, we need to see all countries moving towards the donut this decade rapidly, and particularly in the global north first and fastest, because of our historic responsibilities. So now this is why we love having Andrew in our team, this incredible analysis that tells us the story of the donut from so many different countries' perspectives.
Yes, thank you. And one of the last questions was exactly about the work Andrew Fanning did, if I remember well, with Dan O'Neill. And so we will get there. Before that, I had one question that I wanted to ask. And I know that this question you may think that it can lead us off track, but I'm asking it because in youth movements like ours, we feel it is quite important and we discuss it very often. So we wanted to ask you, in your opinion, is this economic model which overexploits the resources of our planet, as we have seen, and guarantees a level of well-being that is excessive for some people, but seriously insufficient for others? Is this economic model inherent in capitalism or not? Like, can these contradictions be resolved within this economic model, or does it need to be changed? I saw several interviews where Kate showed the black boxes of capitalism and socialism. And so I wanted to ask you if you could come back on that and give us your point of view, because for young people, it's something that really is interesting, or at least is very discussed.
So I usually, when I'm talking and when I'm presenting Doughnut Economics, I don't really use the word capitalism. And I'll tell you why. Is because it means very different things to different people. And I realized that when I went, in fact, to the United States, when my book was first published, and I started talking about a more distributive economy that was within planetary boundaries, and American journalists would say, "Oh, so you're against capitalism?" And I said, "Well, what do you? Or you're a socialist?" And you're like, "Whoa, wow, what do you mean? What is capitalism?" And they say, "Well, it's markets." I said, "Well, that I wouldn't say that a market therefore is capitalism." So I realized quite quickly that people mean very different things. So if we want to talk about capitalism, I would never just say capitalism and we have a debate. I like it, I'm for it, I'm against it, because we might be talking about different things. That's why I made this black box of capitalism. Almost very playful, and I tweeted it and I said, if I was to open this black box of capitalism, what do you expect to find in it? And hundreds of people wrote answers, great answers, but really different answers. Well, actually, we can do a premiere here because now I've made the things that are inside the black box of capitalism, and no one's ever seen them before. Do you want to see them? So I've just begun making this as a little game. Okay, this is a world premiere of the black box of capitalism. So the first thing I think we find in the black box of capitalism is that they're all M's, by the way. It's that the means of, you might not be able to see it, but the means of production are privately owned and controlled, right? And that's the first idea, that people can privately own the means of production. And some people own the means of production, whereas other people just have their labor to sell and they only get a wage. So Karl Marx would like this. He says, yes, some people own the resources and they extract a rent, and some people just provide their wage. Now, once you've got the means of production can be privately owned, now we can introduce the concept of markets, that capitalism involves markets, and that markets, people who like it will say, well, markets give a price signal, and that's a really efficient way of allocating resources. In fact, markets are a really great way of providing for our wants and needs. There's just two problems with markets. They're really good at serving people who can pay, but everybody else they ignore. And they value what's priced, but everything else they exploit. Now, those are two pretty big problems, which is why I would not want to live in an economy that put markets front and center and thought everything else should get out of the way. So we've got the means of production and we've got markets. Then we've got motivations. And at the heart of capitalism, especially in economic models that promote capitalism, is this idea that humanity, if we want to be really efficient and effective in markets, we should pursue our own self-interest. And in fact, we are very greedy. This is the idea. We're very greedy, so we pursue interests of our own, and it works. And that's why markets serve us. And if everybody just pursues their own interests, markets will bring about the ideal result. Well, I'd actually say that's only a tiny part of who humanity actually is. We might be sometimes self-interested. We're also an incredibly social and collaborative and reciprocal creature. We're the most social of all animals. So just describing us that way doesn't get to everything. The fourth thing, now we're getting closer to what I really think is distinct about capitalism, other than markets, it's about money. It's about the design of money. So in capitalism, people will say, well, financial markets that pursue the maximum rate of return, they are really good at allocating capital to the most productive investments. So again, there's this belief that the market will put money where it's most needed. And I would disagree with that. I think financial markets actually, again, they serve those who can pay, and they are not meeting our needs. We need to deeply redesign finance so that it's in service to the real economy, in service to humanity. I think at the moment we have a financial system that's largely in service to itself. And now I'm going to bring out the fifth and final M. So we've had the means of production, markets, motivations, money, and the last one, I've just called it more. The idea that a successful capitalist economy is one that will grow endlessly. And in fact, people who are supportive of capitalism say GDP growth is a sign that humanity is coming up with solutions to its problems. Growth is a marker of generating innovations. And that endless growth is desirable, it's necessary, and it's possible. And again here, as Andrew has said, and we say at Doughnut Economics Action Lab, really, are you so sure? Right? The 20th century economy sees success like this, but we are here on the only living planet in the universe. So we would be pretty wise to learn from our planet, and actually growth on our planet looks like this. Things grow and then they grow up. Now I have 12-year-old twins, right? They are growing very fast. They grow two inches a year. Andrew has kids younger than mine, right? They're growing 2 inches a year. They're boom, boom, boom. My kids are now eye level with me. It's quite unnerving as a parent, I tell you. And I know what's going to happen next. They're going to go back. But if they keep on growing 2 inches a year forever, they literally won't fit in my house. They can't sit at my table. They will not belong. So in nature, we understand deeply that things must grow up. And if something inside my body or anybody's body is trying to grow endlessly, we call that cancer. And we do everything to stop it. So why would we think it was normal to have an economy inside society, inside the living world, this economy that tries to grow forever? So I've taken apart the 5 elements of capitalism. Maybe the means of production can be reunited with the workers. People can have employee-owned, cooperatively owned enterprise. Why not? Markets are useful, but only as part of a wider mix. Motivations, actually, we're motivated in many, many ways. And if we only were motivated by self-interest, we would be a horrible species to hang out with. Money, it needs to be redesigned so that it's in service to life, not in service to itself. And more, I don't believe an economy can grow forever. Now, do you want to call that capitalism? I don't think it's the right word. I would rather talk about regenerative and distributive design and ask what traits it takes to get there. So I prefer to leave capitalism in the intellectual baggage of the 20th century because it causes people to fight, it causes people to get angry and shout and often talk across each other. Let's look at the underlying designs and ask ourselves in detail, how do we bring about regenerative and distributive design?
Thank you very much. It was very excellent answer from my point of view. And okay, I get to the question to Andrew's work with Dan O'Neill. That was, if I remember well, on the links between well-being and carbon intensive consumption. And I recall you saying that if the 2 degrees target is to be achieved without a decline in well-being, then either decoupling needs to be vastly improved or happiness levels need to be made less sensitive to declining consumption. And I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, which of these ways do you think is more likely and more feasible to achieve our goal?
That's a great question. Well, if we stick to the data and the empirical evidence, to date, there is virtually no empirical evidence that the rates of decoupling that are needed in order to continue growing our economies while reducing carbon emissions, there's no evidence that that's taking place at the speed that's needed in order to meet 2 degrees, or better yet, as is becoming more and more consensus, 1.5 degrees warming as a limit beyond which very, very deep impacts start occurring. So empirically, there's no real evidence for decoupling at the speed that's needed. Of course, if we think about happiness levels and making ourselves more resilient to changes in declining growth, or making ourselves so that we don't need economies that grow, it gets into what Kate just spoke about, is how can we redesign our economy so that we're not dependent on this never-ending growth? Because currently we live in economies where it's called a recession if we don't grow, and it's very, very difficult, and it implies hardship because people lose their jobs, they leave their countries to find work elsewhere. There's deep and disruptive and negative impacts from a lack of growth. But that's, I would argue, is a fault of design, as opposed to the decoupling question, which starts really becoming more about physical reality and what we can expect to, can we fight with the laws of thermodynamics, or should we fight with the design of our economies? And I prefer, and I think it's much more likely and realistic to answer the question to focus on the design of our economies rather than physics.
Thank you very much. And Julia, I don't know if you have any other questions, or we are done.
I have a question for you guys.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
I mean, you're the change makers here, right? So I don't know if you're asking us about economic theory and reframing economics. How from where you're sitting in your both in your generation and in your activism, where do you believe you want to put your energy now over the coming years, say for this decade? Where do you feel that you're having traction and impact in influencing the people who we know need to change? Okay, for me, like when I started doing activism in this climate movement, Fridays for Future, I was already still in the high school, and all my friends and all the movement in Italy was like my age. And so now we've taken different streets, different roads in university, in working life. And so I feel this is quite important and quite good, because we have many climate activists in many different places in the world, like me, the economic university, people studying law, studying physics, studying humanities, which is as important as the other
the other fields. And so, like, for me, it would be great to keep on putting the focus on the greatest crisis that I see ahead of us, apart from the pandemic, of course, which is the climate crisis and the biodiversity loss, so all the crises related to global warming. And so I think that, like, in economics, I feel there is still a lack of knowledge about the real challenges we are facing. In our university, we studied it maybe in 1 or 2 courses, and all the rest is like not even taking into account the fact that in 7 years, at the current rate of emissions, we could have run out of our carbon budget, and that economies have a great power in creating a sustainable society. So I think that's something that I would like to work on, and to keep, like, trying to change the mindset. Maybe I will not have the impact that you two have had on the economics theory and world, but I think I will try to do that. And yes, the last questions I wanted to ask you is that on the 19th of March, so in 2 weeks, we are going to organize, as a Fridays for Future movement and Extinction Rebellion and other movements, the next global climate strike. It will be different from the previous ones. It will be only online in many countries, but still it is important because, like, we gather many people all around the world, and we ask politicians and citizens to think about the deep crisis we are still facing. And so yes, we are trying to do our best, and if you have any suggestions or any advice for young activists who are trying to push this agenda, we are, like, really happy to hear them. And yes, we thank you for your great work you have been doing during these years.
Well, I'll just jump in and say thank you for that answer. Really interesting. And you said, I don't know if I'll have the same impact that you're having, but Luca, I think of this as big teamwork, right? None of what any one of us is doing has an impact on its own. Greta sitting outside the Swedish parliament has no impact on her own unless everybody else joins in. And the ideas of Doughnut Economics have no impact unless people in places of influence, which is, by the way, everywhere, from the school gates to the ministry, to the shop, to the community meeting, people in places of influence use them and start putting them into practice. And I love what you said about your high school friends and colleagues now going off into these different fields. I mean, that is powerful, because then you begin to have a network of climate aware change makers in every field, and that's when you can begin to build critical mass of networks across these areas. So the striking online, of course, it's very different from that physical meeting, and the power and the sense of camaraderie that we get in the street, being together and being physically present and other people seeing it. And it's much harder to create the same sense online. And so I suppose that, of course, the plan must be, let's not try and do the same thing, because it won't be the same. What do we do that's different? How do we use the online nature of it to build impact? And I would love to be involved, and I don't yet know how I'm going to be involved, but I really believe in this work and the energy that it's created. And I'd love to hear from Andrew or Julia.
I'll jump in very quickly, because certainly I just need to completely agree with what Kate said, or if you mentioned about our impact, it's not us, it's everybody, it's a big team. And what you reminded me about this event, the mostly online only, global event for Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, it reminded me of the last global event when we could meet on the streets. And actually I can even show, I do have a donut that, like, it has, which it's got both sides, but actually this comes from, it's a piece that I've gotten where I'm actually in Spain, and what this says is pregunta a una investigador o investigadora, and what we did, or ask a climate researcher. And so what we did as a researcher, a scientist, so to speak, in a way to support the Global Day of Action, recognizing that, I'm not a Fridays for Future, I want to support, but I don't want to take over. So what we did was we set up next to the rally just with this, a couple of researchers with some binders, just saying, hey, if anybody has any questions, I'm a climate scientist. I'm deeply related in climate change research, climate change impacts. Feel free to ask me anything that you like. Totally support you guys. So if there's a way to bring that into the online type of event, then I'm completely for it. So I'm just happy to support the movement as well. Big teamwork.